The needle slipped through calico and cotton with practiced ease, though Julia Emerson's fingers trembled from cold and hunger as she worked by candlelight in the drafty cabin that had become her prison of poverty. 2 years had passed since pneumonia claimed her husband Robert during the brutal Montana winter of 1882, leaving her with nothing but debts, a failing homestead 10 miles outside Riverton, and the skills her grandmother had taught her with needle and thread. The quilts she created were beautiful, intricate works that took weeks to complete, yet the general store offered her mere pennies for each one, barely enough to keep flour in the cupboard and wood for the stove. She stretched her aching back and held up the latest quilt to examine in the flickering light. This one featured a star pattern in deep blues and creams, each stitch perfectly aligned despite her exhaustion. Tomorrow she would take it into town along with the 2 others she had finished this month. Perhaps Mr. Henderson at the store would offer her 15 cents instead of 10 this time, though she doubted it. He knew she had no other options, no other way to survive out here alone. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose window panes she couldn't afford to fix. Julia pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and returned to her work. Sleep would come later, after she finished at least another square. At 24 years old, she felt ancient, worn down by grief and constant worry about making it through each day. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the January sun bright but offering little warmth. Julia carefully folded her 3 completed quilts, wrapped them in brown paper, and hitched her aging mare to the wagon. The journey into Riverton took nearly 2 hours on the frozen, rutted road, giving her plenty of time to rehearse the conversation she would have with Mr. Henderson. She needed 20 cents per quilt this time, needed it desperately, or she would not make it through February. Riverton bustled with activity despite the cold. Cowboys from the surrounding ranches had come to town for supplies, their horses tied along the main street. Julia guided her wagon to the general store and carefully carried her precious cargo inside. Mr. Henderson barely looked up from his ledger. "Morning, Mrs. Emerson. More quilts, 3 this time." She laid them on the counter, unwrapping each one with care. "They are my finest work yet. The stitching is exceptionally tight and the patterns are more complex than usual." He examined them with disinterest. 8 cents each. Her heart sank. "But you paid 10 last month. These are better quality." "Got too many quilts already. 8 cents, take it or leave it." Julia felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. 24 cents would not even buy enough flour and beans to last 2 weeks. "Please, Mr. Henderson, I need at least 10 cents each. I have not eaten properly in days." "Not my concern. You should have thought about that before your husband went and died on you." The cruelty of his words struck her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to respond when the bell above the door chimed and heavy footsteps entered the store. "I will give you $50 for all 3. Julia spun around to find herself facing a tall man in a sheepskin coat, his broad-brimmed hat dusted with snow. He had removed the hat upon entering, revealing dark hair silvered at the temples and eyes the color of a summer thunderstorm. His face was weathered but handsome, with strong features that spoke of time spent outdoors. She guessed him to be in his early 30s. "I beg your pardon," she managed to say. "Those quilts." He gestured to the counter. $50 for all 3. That is a fair price for quality work." Mr. Henderson sputtered. "Now see here, Mr. Zimmerman, these quilts are store merchandise." "Not yet they are not." The man, Zimmerman, pulled out a leather wallet. "The lady has not accepted your insulting offer." He counted out bills and held them toward Julia. $50, madam." Julia stared at the money as if it were a mirage. $50 was more than she had seen in 6 months. It was salvation. It was suspicious. Why would you pay so much? His eyes met hers, and she saw nothing but honesty there. Because they are worth it. And because no woman should be cheated when she is already struggling. Her pride wanted to refuse charity, but her growling stomach and the memory of her cold cabin made the decision for her. She took the money with shaking hands. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." He gathered the quilts under one arm. "The pleasure is mine. These will look fine in my ranch house." He tipped his hat to her. "Good day, Mrs. Emerson." He knew her name. She wanted to ask how, wanted to say something more, but he was already walking out the door. Julia stood frozen, clutching the bills, aware of Mr. Henderson's furious glare. "You just lost yourself a customer," the store owner said coldly. "I believe I just found a better one," she replied, surprised by her own boldness. She used some of the money to buy proper supplies, including meat and fresh vegetables she had not been able to afford in months. As she loaded her wagon, she noticed several people watching her with curiosity. A woman about her own age approached, bundled in a fine wool coat. "Excuse me, but did I just see Colt Zimmerman buy your quilts? If that was his name, then yes." The woman smiled. "He owns the largest cattle ranch in the territory, the CZ Ranch, about 15 miles northwest of town. He is a good man, fair employer. Lost his parents 5 years ago and has been running the place alone since then. Everyone wondered if he would ever show interest in anything besides cattle and horses." Julia absorbed this information, unsure what to make of it. He was very generous. "Colt Zimmerman does not do anything without reason." The woman extended a gloved hand. "I am Margaret Porter. My husband runs the bank. Julia Emerson. I know. I am sorry about Robert. Pneumonia is a terrible thing." Margaret's sympathy seemed genuine. "Those quilts you make are truly beautiful. I have seen them in Henderson's store and always thought he undervalued them terribly. Thank you. They are all I have to support myself." "Well, if you make more, perhaps you should bring them directly to some of the ranch houses. I know several women who would pay fair prices. I would be interested in purchasing one myself." They talked for several more minutes, and by the time Julia left town, she had 3 commissions and felt something she had not experienced in 2 years: hope. The winter days passed more easily with money for supplies and the promise of future sales. Julia threw herself into her work with renewed energy, creating quilts in patterns she had only dreamed of attempting before. The star pattern that Colt Zimmerman had bought became her signature, and she incorporated it into each new design. She tried not to think about the rancher too much, but his face crept into her thoughts as she worked. His quiet strength, the way he had stood up to Mr. Henderson without raising his voice, the genuine appreciation in his eyes when he looked at her quilts. No one had looked at her work that way in so long. 3 weeks after their first meeting, Julia was hanging laundry on the line when she heard a horse approaching. She turned to see Colt Zimmerman riding up on a magnificent bay gelding. Her heart inexplicably quickened. "Good morning, Mrs. Emerson." He dismounted with easy grace. "I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all." She wiped her damp hands on her apron, suddenly conscious of her worn dress and wind-blown hair. "Is something wrong with the quilts?" "Quite the opposite. They are even more beautiful than I realized. I hung one in my parlor and put the others in the guest rooms." He reached into his saddlebag. "I came because I would like to commission more if you are willing." "Of course. How many would you need?" "As many as you can make. I will pay $50 each." He pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I also took the liberty of mentioning your work to some other ranchers. These 5 families have asked me to inquire if you would be willing to make quilts for them as well." Julia took the paper with trembling hands. 5 more commissions, at fair prices. "Mr. Zimmerman, I do not know what to say." "Colt, please, and you need not say anything. Your work speaks for itself." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I also wanted to mention that my housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, recently left to live with her daughter in California. I am looking for someone to help manage the house, do some cooking and such. The position pays $40 a month, plus room and board if desired. You would have your own cottage on the property." Julia felt dizzy. It was too much, too generous. "Why are you doing this?" Colt met her eyes steadily. "Because I have been where you are. After my parents died, the ranch nearly failed. I was drowning in debt, barely keeping food on the table. A neighboring rancher, old Bill Crawford, gave me a loan with no interest and no timeline for repayment. He said, 'Pay it forward someday, son. This is me paying it forward.' I see. But she sensed there was more to it than that. Also," he continued, his voice softer, "I have watched you in town these past months. Watched you struggle and keep your dignity while men like Henderson tried to break you down. You remind me that strength comes in many forms." Heat rose to her cheeks. "You have been watching me. Not in any improper way. Riverton is a small town. One notices things." He shifted his weight, suddenly looking less certain. "I apologize if I have made you uncomfortable. The job offer is genuine, no strings attached. You could live in the cottage and have complete privacy. I simply thought it might be easier than managing out here alone." Julia looked at her failing homestead, at the cabin with its broken windows and sagging roof. She thought about the long, cold nights, the constant worry, the grinding loneliness. Then she thought about having steady work, fair pay, and not having to do it all alone anymore. "I would need to think about it," she said carefully. "Of course. Take all the time you need." He mounted his horse. "I will be in town next Friday if you would like to send word. Otherwise, I will assume you prefer to stay independent and I will respect that." He rode away, leaving Julia standing in her yard with a head full of questions and a heart that beat just a little faster than it should. That night, she lay awake weighing her options. The practical part of her screamed to accept. She could make quilts in a warm house with plenty of supplies. She would have regular meals and a steady income. She could save money, perhaps eventually buy a small house in town. But the fearful part of her, the part that still grieved Robert, worried about what people would say. A young widow living on a bachelor's ranch. The gossip would be merciless. And what if Colt Zimmerman expected more than housekeeping? What if this was all an elaborate scheme? Yet when she remembered his eyes, she saw only honesty. And Margaret Porter had called him a good man. By Friday, Julia had made her decision. She dressed in her best dress, a dark blue wool that had been her Sunday finest before Robert died, and drove into Riverton. She found Colt loading supplies onto a large wagon outside the general store. "Mrs. Emerson." He straightened immediately, his face carefully neutral. "Have you come to a decision?" "I have. I would like to accept your offer with one condition." "Name it." "I will live in the cottage and work as your housekeeper, but I want a written contract stating the terms of employment. I need everything to be proper and clear." A smile broke across his face like sunrise. "Absolutely. I will have my lawyer draw up the papers. Can you be ready to move by the end of the month? I can be ready in 2 weeks. Then let me help you. I will send some men to repair what they can at your place and help move your belongings." "That is not necessary." "Perhaps not, but I am offering anyway." His eyes twinkled. "I am stubborn that way." True to his word, 3 ranch hands arrived at her homestead the following Monday. They fixed the windows, patched the roof, and helped her pack her meager belongings. When they discovered she had not eaten breakfast, one of them rode back to the ranch and returned with fresh bread, cheese, and apples from the ranch kitchen. "Boss said to make sure you are fed proper," the young cowboy explained. "Said you have been working too hard on too little food." Julia did not know whether to be grateful or embarrassed by Colt's thoughtfulness. By the end of the second week, she found herself standing in front of a charming cottage on the CZ ranch, her possessions unloaded and her new life beginning. The cottage had 2 rooms, a small kitchen with a good stove and windows that actually kept out the wind. It was paradise. Colt showed her around the main ranch house, a sprawling structure built from logs and stone. The interior was well furnished but clearly needed a woman's touch. Dust coated the surfaces, and the kitchen had the disorganized look of a place used by someone who cooked only out of necessity. "I am not much of a housekeeper," Colt admitted sheepishly. "Mrs. Chen tried her best to train me, but I am afraid I reverted to bachelor ways once she left." "I can see that." Julia ran a finger along a shelf and examined the dust. "When did you last have a proper meal? Define proper. Something other than beans and bacon. In that case, it has been a while." She rolled up her sleeves. "Then we should start with supper. Show me the pantry." That first evening, Julia cooked a meal of roasted chicken, potatoes, and vegetables. She set the table in the dining room, using the good china she found in the cabinet. When she called Colt in from the barn, he stopped in the doorway and stared. "It has been years since this room was used," he said quietly. "Then it was past time." She gestured to a chair. "Please sit." They ate in slightly awkward silence at first, but gradually conversation began to flow. Colt told her about the ranch, about his parents who had built it from nothing, about the hard years after their deaths when he nearly lost everything. "Bill Crawford saved me," he said. "And not just with money. He taught me how to really run a ranch, how to manage the business side. I owed him everything. He must have seen something special in you to take that risk." He said I reminded him of himself at that age, stubborn, proud, too determined to fail. Colt smiled. "I suppose he was right about the stubborn part." "I have noticed that," Julia said, and was rewarded with his laugh. "What about you?" he asked. "How did you end up in Montana?" Julia told him about meeting Robert in Missouri, about how he had dreams of claiming land and building a life in the territories. He was so excited about the adventure. "I got caught up in his enthusiasm and did not think about the reality of frontier life until we were already here." "Did you love him?" The question was too direct, too personal, but something in Colt's eyes made her want to answer honestly. "I cared for him very much. He was kind and he tried so hard. But we were very young when we married, barely 18. I'm not sure either of us really understood what love was supposed to be." Colt nodded slowly. "My parents used to say that real love was built over time, through shared struggles and small kindnesses. That the lightning bolt romance of dime novels was just fancy." "Your parents sound wise." "They were. I miss them every day." After that first dinner, a routine developed. Julia would spend her mornings managing the house, cooking meals, and doing lighter chores. Her afternoons were her own, dedicated to her quilting. Colt made sure she had a comfortable room in the main house with good light for her work, though she still slept in the cottage. The ranch hands treated her with respectful friendliness. She learned their names and their stories. Young Tommy was barely 19, sending most of his pay back to his mother in St. Louis. Old Pete had been with the ranch since Colt's father first built it. Diego came from Texas, escaping a violent father. They all clearly admired Colt, and she began to understand why. She watched how he treated everyone fairly, how he worked alongside his men rather than just ordering them around, how he knew each of their families and circumstances. When Tommy came down with influenza, Colt personally rode into town for medicine and sat up with the young man through the worst of it. "That is just who he is," Pete told her one afternoon. "Never known a fairer man." As February turned into March, Julia found herself looking forward to the evenings when she and Colt would have supper together. Their conversations ranged from practical matters about the ranch to deeper discussions about books, dreams, and philosophies of life. She discovered he was well-read despite his rough exterior, that he had a dry wit that made her laugh, and that he listened to her opinions as if they truly mattered. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Colt asked about her quilting. "Where did you learn such intricate patterns?" "My grandmother taught me. She was a quilter back in Kentucky, known throughout the county for her work. She said that every quilt tells a story, that the colors and patterns reflect the maker's heart." "What story do your quilts tell?" Julia considered the question. "These days, I think they tell a story about endurance, about taking scraps and broken pieces and making something beautiful from them." "Like life," Colt said softly. "Yes, like life." Their eyes met across the firelight, and Julia felt something shift between them. Not the wild passion of novels, but something quieter and more profound. A recognition, a sense of belonging. Colt cleared his throat. "Julia, I want you to know that you are not just an employee to me. You have become a friend. This house feels like a home again, and it is because of you." "I feel the same," she admitted. "I was so lonely before. I did not realize how much until I came here and remembered what it felt like to have someone to talk to at the end of the day. I am glad you said yes to my offer. So am I." As spring arrived, the ranch burst into activity. Calving season kept everyone busy from dawn until late at night. Julia found herself not just cooking but also helping in other ways, bringing food and coffee out to the men in the fields, even assisting with a difficult birth when extra hands were needed. "You are a natural," Colt told her as they walked back to the house one evening, both exhausted but satisfied. "Most women would faint at the sight of all that blood." "I grew up on a farm," Julia reminded him. "I have seen plenty of blood. Still, not everyone can keep their head in a crisis." "You did well today." His praise warmed her more than it should have. In late April, Julia was working on a quilt in her sewing room when she heard a commotion outside. She went to the window and saw a woman climbing down from a fancy carriage, her dress and bearing screaming money and city sophistication. Colt emerged from the barn, and his face went carefully blank when he saw the visitor. Julia watched as the woman rushed to him, placing her hands on his arms in a familiar way that made Julia's stomach twist unexpectedly. At dinner that evening, Colt was quiet and distracted. "Is everything all right?" Julia finally asked. He sighed. "That woman today, Victoria. We were engaged once back before my parents died. When the ranch fell on hard times, she broke it off and moved to Denver, married a banker. I see. She is divorced now, came back to see if I might still be interested." He looked directly at Julia. "I am not. You do not owe me explanations about your personal life." "Perhaps not, but I want you to know anyway. Victoria represents a life I used to think I wanted. Refinement, culture, all the things this rough ranch life lacks. But I have learned that those things do not matter much if the person is not genuine." Julia set down her fork. "What does matter? Kindness matters. Strength matters. Someone who does not run when things get hard, who appreciates the beauty in simple things, who makes a house feel like home just by being in it." His voice was rough with emotion. "Someone like you." Her heart hammered in her chest. "Colt, I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything. I am not asking for anything from you, Julia. I just wanted you to know how I feel." He stood abruptly. "I apologize if I have made you uncomfortable. I will understand if you want to leave." "Leave?" She stood as well. "Why would I want to leave?" "Because I have crossed a line. You are my employee, and I have put you in an awkward position." "You have not." Julia moved around the table toward him. Do you truly think I have not felt this growing between us? I have been fighting it because I was afraid. Afraid of being hurt again, afraid of what people would say, afraid of my own feelings. And now I think I am tired of being afraid. She reached out and took his hand. I care for you, Colt Zimmerman, more than I should, more than I plan to, but I do. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with a gentleness that belied his strength. I have been half in love with you since that day in the general store when you stood up so brave despite being terrified. Watching you here, seeing your grace and your strength every day, I fell the rest of the way. Julia tilted her face up to his. Then perhaps you should kiss me. He did, and it was nothing like the few kisses she had shared with Robert. This was fire and tenderness, passion and promise. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. I want to court you properly, Colt said. I want to do this right. We are a bit past proper, considering I live on your ranch. Nevertheless, I will court you, and when enough time has passed and we are both certain, I will ask you to marry me, but only if that is what you want. It is. Julia smiled. Though I think we may cause quite the scandal, let them talk. I do not care about gossip. Neither do I, not anymore. They took their time, wanting to be sure and wanting to give the relationship room to grow naturally. Colt took Julia into Riverton on Sundays, and they attended church together. They went on picnics, rides through the countryside, and long walks around the ranch. They talked about everything under the sun, learning each other's minds as well as their hearts. Julia continued to make quilts, and her reputation grew throughout the territory. Orders came from as far away as Helena, and she began to earn more money than she had ever imagined. Colt insisted she save it all for herself. You have earned it with your own skill and labor, he said firmly. I will not have you feeling dependent on me or anyone else. In June, Colt asked Diego to help him build a gazebo near the creek that ran through the ranch property. Julia watched the project take shape over several weeks, touched by the care he put into every detail. On a warm evening in late July, Colt led her down to the newly finished gazebo. Someone had strung lanterns around it, and wildflowers filled vases on the railings. This is beautiful, Julia breathed. I wanted to create something special, a place just for us. Colt took both her hands in his. Julia Emerson, these past months have been the happiest of my life. You have brought light and laughter and love into my world. I cannot imagine my future without you in it. He dropped to one knee, pulling a small box from his pocket. Inside was a ring with a simple gold band and a single sapphire. It was my grandmother's, he explained. The only valuable thing my father's family brought west. I would be honored if you would wear it, if you would consent to be my wife. Tears streamed down Julia's face. Yes, yes, absolutely yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. They held each other as the sun set over the Montana mountains, the creek singing beside them and the future stretching bright before them. They were married in September, once the harvest was complete, and they could take time to plan a proper wedding. The ceremony took place at the church in Riverton, with Margaret Porter as Julia's attendant and Pete standing up for Colt. It seemed half the territory came to wish them well, filling the church to overflowing. Julia wore a dress she had sewn herself from cream-colored silk Colt had ordered from Denver. She carried wildflowers from the ranch, and her something blue was the sapphire ring on her finger. As they exchanged vows, Julia marveled at how her life had transformed. 2 years ago she had been starving and desperate. Now she stood beside a man who loved her truly, surrounded by friends, with a future full of promise. The reception at the ranch lasted well into the night. The barn had been cleaned and decorated, and tables groaned under the weight of food everyone had brought. There was dancing and laughter, and when Colt whirled Julia around the floor, she felt as light as air. "Happy," he murmured in her ear. "Happier than I knew was possible." "Good. I intend to keep you that way for the next 50 years or so." "Only 50? Well, longer if we can manage it." That night, in the main ranch house that was now truly their home, they came together as husband and wife. Colt was patient and tender, and Julia discovered that passion was indeed real, not just the fancy of novels. "I love you," she whispered in the darkness afterward, curled against his chest. "And I love you, more than words can say." The first year of their marriage was full of adjustment and joy. Julia took over managing the ranch house completely, proving to have a good head for the business side as well as the domestic. She started keeping the books and discovered several ways they could reduce expenses and increase profits. "You have a gift for this," Colt said, reviewing her neat columns of figures. "Numbers make sense to me. They are like quilt patterns. Everything has to line up properly." She also began teaching quilting to women in the area, holding classes at the ranch once a week. It became a social event, with ladies coming from all the neighboring ranches to learn and gossip and share their lives. Julia found herself at the center of a community in a way she had never been before. By spring, she discovered she was pregnant. Colt was overjoyed, immediately becoming protective and worried. "I am not made of glass," Julia laughed when he tried to prevent her from lifting a wash basket. "I know, but humor me. You are carrying my child, our child, and I am perfectly capable of doing normal activities." But she was secretly touched by his concern. As her belly grew through the summer, Colt would rest his hand on it each night, talking to their baby and making plans for the future. "Boy or girl, it does not matter," he said. "As long as you both come through healthy, that is all I care about." In November of 1884, Julia went into labor. The midwife came from town, and Margaret Porter arrived to help as well. Colt paced outside the bedroom, wearing a path in the hallway floor despite Pete's attempts to distract him with ranch business. After 12 hours of labor, Julia delivered a healthy baby boy. They named him Robert Colt Zimmerman, honoring both Julia's first husband and his father. Colt held his son with trembling hands, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face. "He is perfect. You are amazing. I cannot believe we made this little person." "We certainly did." Julia was exhausted but radiant. "And he has your nose. Poor child." They both laughed, giddy with relief and joy. Robert, whom they called Robbie, was a good baby, healthy and strong. Colt proved to be a devoted father, often found walking the floor at night with his son when Robbie was fussy, singing old cowboy songs in his rough voice until the baby settled. Julia watched her husband become a father and fell in love with him all over again. Life on the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. The cattle business prospered under their joint management. Julia's quilting brought in additional income that they saved for Robbie's future. They added onto the house, creating a proper nursery and a larger sewing room for Julia's growing business. 2 years after Robbie was born, Julia delivered twin girls. They named them Catherine and Elizabeth, and Colt joked that he was now hopelessly outnumbered by females. "You love it," Julia teased, watching him juggle a twin in each arm while Robbie climbed on his back. "I absolutely do," he admitted. As the children grew, the ranch grew with them. They added more cattle, bought out a neighboring property, and built a bunkhouse for the increasing number of ranch hands they employed. Pete retired but stayed on the property in a small cabin, declaring he was too old to start over somewhere new. Julia continued her quilting, now teaching her daughters the craft as they got old enough to hold needles. She never forgot the dark days when quilting had been the only thing standing between her and starvation. Now it was an art she practiced for love rather than necessity, though she still made quilts for families in need, remembering what it felt like to be desperate. One evening when Robbie was 6 and the twins were 4, the family gathered around the dinner table and Colt announced he had a surprise. "I have been working with the bank," he said. "We are donating money to build a school in Riverton, a proper school with a real teacher, so children do not have to travel to Helena for education." Julia reached for his hand. "That is wonderful. I want our children to have opportunities, and I want other children to have them too. Education matters." "Your parents would be so proud of you," Julia said softly. "I hope so. I know they would have loved you and the children." "Tell us about Grandma and Grandpa," Robbie demanded. Colt launched into stories about his parents, about building the ranch and the adventures of early frontier days. The children listened with wide eyes, and Julia felt her heart swell with contentment. This was the life she had never dared dream of during those cold, lonely nights in her failing cabin. A loving husband, beautiful children, a home filled with warmth and laughter, and work that fulfilled her. The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and milestones. Robbie grew tall and serious, already showing his father's gift with horses. Catherine was fearless and adventurous, always climbing trees and exploring. Elizabeth was gentle and artistic, spending hours with her mother learning intricate quilt patterns. In 1892, when Julia was 34 and Colt 39, they added one more child to their family. Another boy, whom they named William after Colt's father. "I think we might be done now," Julia said, nursing the baby while watching Colt corral the older children. "Probably wise," he agreed, looking slightly overwhelmed. "Though I said that after the twins. This time I mean it." But she smiled as she said it. The children adored their baby brother, fighting over who got to help with him. The ranch house was never quiet anymore, always full of noise and life and love. One autumn evening, after the children were all in bed, Julia and Colt sat on the porch swing watching the stars emerge. "You ever think about how different things might have been?" Julia asked. "How do you mean?" "If you had not come into the general store that day, if you had not been kind to a desperate widow." Colt pulled her closer. "I think about it sometimes, how close I came to never knowing you, never having this life. It terrifies me. Me too. But I also think we were meant to find each other. Call it fate, call it God's plan, call it luck. Whatever brought us together, I am grateful for it every single day." Julia turned to kiss him. "I love you, Colt Zimmerman. And I love you, Julia Zimmerman." He rested his forehead against hers. "Thank you for taking a chance on a rough rancher who did not know the first thing about courting a lady properly. Thank you for seeing value in my quilts when no one else did, for seeing value in me. That was easy. You are the most valuable thing in my life." They sat in comfortable silence, holding each other as they had countless times over the years. The ranch spread out around them, prosperous and peaceful. Inside the house, their children slept safely. It was everything they had worked for, everything they had built together. As the years continued to advance, the Zimmerman Ranch became known throughout Montana, not just for quality cattle, but for the family that ran it. People spoke of Colt's fairness and Julia's kindness, of how they employed and helped dozens of families, of the school they had funded and the community they had built. Robbie grew into a fine young man, taking over more of the ranch operations as Colt's hair turned from silver to white. Catherine married a neighboring rancher's son, a good man who treated her well. Elizabeth became a teacher at the very school her parents had helped establish. And William, showing signs of being as stubborn as his father, declared his intention to become a veterinarian. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Julia finished a special quilt. It depicted the story of their life together, from a small square showing her old cabin to larger panels illustrating the ranch, their wedding, each of their children. In the center was a star pattern, the same design that had been on the first quilt Colt ever bought from her. She presented it to him at a party thrown by their children, with half the territory in attendance. Colt unfolded it slowly, taking in each panel, understanding the story she had sewn. When he looked up, his eyes were wet with tears. "It is perfect," he said hoarsely. "Like you, like our life together." "We have been blessed," Julia agreed. "More than blessed. We have been lucky and loved and given more than we deserved." That night, lying in bed under the quilt, Colt traced the stitching with one finger. "You remember what you told me quilts are?" he asked. "Stories in fabric, the maker's heart sewn into every stitch. I remember." "What story does this one tell?" Julia thought about her answer. "It tells the story of second chances, of finding love when you thought love was lost, of building something beautiful from broken pieces." "It tells our story," Colt said simply. "Yes, our story." As they grew older, Julia and Colt made sure to pass on the lessons they had learned. They taught their children and grandchildren about hard work, about treating people fairly, about the importance of kindness and second chances. Julia never stopped quilting. Even in her 70s, her fingers still moved with practiced skill, though slower than before. She made quilts for each grandchild, each one unique and special. And she still taught classes, now helped by Elizabeth and several of her granddaughters. The story of how she and Colt met became family legend, told and retold at gatherings. How a widow had been selling quilts for pennies, and a rancher had bought them all and won her heart in the process. "It sounds like a fairy tale when you say it like that," Julia protested once. "But it is true," Colt said. "Every wonderful word of it." On a summer evening in 1909, when Julia was 51 and Colt 58, they gathered their entire family for a photograph. 4 children, their spouses, and 9 grandchildren assembled on the porch of the ranch house. The photographer positioned everyone carefully, making sure everyone could be seen. "Everyone ready," he called. "Say cheese." But before he could snap the picture, Colt leaned over and kissed Julia. The camera captured it, that moment of pure love, and it became Julia's favorite photograph. "You ruined the formal picture," she scolded him afterward, though she was laughing. "I improved it," he countered. "Now it shows what this family is really built on." And what is that? Love, pure and simple. As they moved into their 60s and then 70s, Julia and Colt gradually handed over more responsibilities to their children. Robbie ran the ranch with the same fairness his father had always shown. Catherine and her husband managed a successful horse breeding operation on their own property. Elizabeth continued teaching, inspiring a new generation. William returned from veterinary school and opened a practice in Riverton, serving all the animals in the territory. Julia and Colt spent their days working on smaller projects, spending time with grandchildren, and enjoying the life they had built. Every evening they would sit on the porch swing, holding hands and watching the sun set over the mountains. "We did all right, did we not?" Colt said one such evening. "We did better than all right, we did wonderfully." "Any regrets?" Julia considered the question seriously. "None. Even the hard times, the struggles and the pain, they brought us here. I would not change anything. Not even those first terrible years after Robert died, not even those, because they led me to that general store on the day you walked in and changed everything." Colt kissed her temple. "I was so scared that day. You seemed so confident. I was terrified. I had been working up the courage to approach you for weeks. When I saw Henderson cheating you, it gave me the excuse I needed. But I was afraid you would reject the money, afraid you would see through my motives." "Your motives?" I wanted to help you, yes. But I also wanted a reason to talk to you, to be part of your life. I had been half in love with you for months, watching you drive through town with your head held high despite everything you were going through. Julia laughed. And here I thought it was a simple act of kindness. It was that too, but it was also a lonely rancher taking his shot with a woman who made his heart beat faster. Well, I am glad you took that shot. So am I. Best decision I ever made buying those quilts. You bought more than quilts. I bought a future. I bought happiness. I bought the only thing that ever truly mattered, love. They sat in silence, comfortable and content as the stars emerged one by one above them. Somewhere in the house, grandchildren were laughing. In the barn, cattle lowed peacefully. Across the fields, the ranch they had built together sprawled in prosperous peace. It was not the life Julia had imagined as a desperate widow stitching quilts for pennies in a freezing cabin. It was so much better than anything she could have dreamed. And it all started with a simple act of kindness, a generous payment for beautiful work, and two lonely people finding each other when they both needed it most. As the years continued, Julia and Colt remained the heart of their family. They celebrated birthdays and holidays, welcomed new grandchildren and even great-grandchildren. They saw Montana grow from rough frontier territory to a more established state. They watched Riverton transform from a small frontier town to a proper city with paved streets and electric lights. Through it all, they remained devoted to each other. Colt still brought Julia wildflowers from the fields. Julia still made Colt's favorite meals and patched his shirts with careful stitches. They held hands during church services and danced together at family gatherings, moving slower than they once had, but with no less love. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1924, the entire family threw them a massive celebration. People came from all over Montana, former ranch hands and their families, women Julia had taught to quilt, families they had helped over the years. The party lasted 2 days, with food and music and story after story about the impact Julia and Colt had made on so many lives. I had no idea we touched so many people, Julia said, overwhelmed by the outpouring. That is because you never did it for recognition, their daughter Elizabeth pointed out. You did it because it was right. That night, exhausted but happy, Julia and Colt retired to their bedroom. Julia noticed that Colt had hung the anniversary quilt she had made him years ago in a place of honor on the wall. "When did you do that?" she asked. "This morning. I wanted it where I could see it every day, remember the journey we have taken together." Julia studied the quilt, seeing their whole life laid out in fabric and thread. "It is quite a story, is it not?" "The best story ever told," Colt agreed. He pulled her into his arms and they danced slowly around the room with no music but the beating of their hearts. "Thank you for saying yes, all those years ago. Thank you for taking a chance on me. Thank you for seeing me when I thought I was invisible. Thank you for valuing my work and my heart, always. Until my last breath I will treasure you." They continued dancing. Two people who had found each other against the odds and built a life more beautiful than either had dreamed possible. Outside, Montana spread wild and beautiful under the stars. Inside, in this room where they had shared 40 years of marriage, love remained as strong as ever. When Julia and Colt finally passed, years later within months of each other, they left behind a legacy that extended far beyond cattle and land. They left behind children and grandchildren who understood the value of hard work and kindness. They left behind a community they had helped build and strengthen. They left behind memories of love and generosity that inspired everyone who knew them. And in houses throughout Montana, quilts made by Julia Zimmerman were treasured as family heirlooms. each one telling a story of beauty created from scraps, of value found in unexpected places, of love that transformed everything it touched. The widow who had stitched quilts for pennies had become a beloved matriarch. The rancher who had bought them all had gained so much more than beautiful handiwork. Together, they had created something that endured beyond their lifetimes, a love story that people would tell for generations to come, about how sometimes the most valuable things cannot be measured in dollars, only in the size of the hearts involved. Their great-grandchildren would grow up hearing the story of how great-grandma Julia had been desperate and alone, selling quilts to survive, and how great-grandpa Colt had walked into that general store and changed everything with one act of generosity and recognition. They would hear about the courtship, the wedding, the building of a family and a legacy. And they would learn that true love was not something that struck like lightning, but something that grew steadily, fed by kindness and respect and the choice to keep loving even when times were hard. The CZ Ranch continued to operate for many years under the management of their descendants. The cottage where Julia had first lived still stood, preserved as a reminder of humble beginnings. The gazebo by the creek where Colt had proposed remained a favorite spot for family gatherings. And in the main house, under glass in the parlor, hung the first quilt Colt had ever bought from Julia, the star pattern that had started it all. Visitors to the ranch would often ask about the quilt and hear the story. How a widow was selling them for pennies. How a rancher bought them all. How he bought her heart too, though neither of them quite realized it at first. How love could bloom in the most unexpected places, between the most unexpected people, when hearts were open and kindness was freely given. It was a story as timeless as the Montana mountains, as enduring as the quilts Julia had sewn with such care. A story of second chances and new beginnings, of finding home in another person, of building a life stitch by careful stitch, until the pattern became clear and beautiful. And if you listened carefully on quiet evenings at the ranch, old-timers would swear you could still hear the echo of laughter from the porch, still see the swing moving gently as if two people sat there watching the sunset, still feel the love that had soaked into every board and beam of the place. The widow had been stitching quilts for pennies, each stitch a prayer for survival. The rancher had bought them all, seeing value where others saw only scraps and thread. And in the process, he had bought her heart and she had claimed his in return. Together, they had woven a life as beautiful and intricate as any quilt, a testament to the transforming power of love, kindness, and two people choosing each other every single day for the rest of their lives.